There we go. Told me recording in progress in a very scary voice, so that sounds like it's done it. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you are doing well. My name is Azaan. I'm currently doing an MSc in International Social and Public Policy at the LSE. And I was formerly a teacher, and a lot of my interest in this area comes from kind of that time in my career experiences. I'll pass on to Raiesa, who will introduce herself.
Hello, yes, I'm Raiesa. Thank you everyone for joining us. I'm studying social justice and education at UCL. That's part-time. I also work as a regional manager for an educational charity as well.
Lovely, thanks, Raiesa. So in terms of the format of the session today, we're going to take you through kind of a sort of brief introduction to the work in intersectionality, what some of the literature says about it. We're then going to look at essentially some developments within intersectionality and how it's kind of come along within the literature and within kind of recent body of work, before taking you through my research. Raiesa will take you through her research. And then we'll just have some sort of, at the end, a sort of short discussion section. What we'd really love, of course, as well is, I mean, if you feel comfortable to, we'd love to see your faces. So if you'd love to put your camera on, that'd be great. If you don't want to, no problem at all. But certainly in the discussion section, when we're kind of doing some more interactive stuff, and also at the start, we'd love to hear from some people. So it would be great to hear from you guys later on as well, not just us talking. So I'll pass on to Raiesa, who will take us through the first self-reflective exercise.
Thank you. So I love a Mentimeter. I don't know about anyone else. If you don't know what Mentimeter is, it's just a tool to help us engage with you. So I'm going to put it in the chat as well, but if you could go to menti.com and enter the code that's in the chat, it's going to come up with the first question. So both of these questions, in case you hadn't guessed, are related to intersectionality. Azaan, I think you might have to give me permission so that I can present the actual word cloud that gets formed.
Sorry, I was saying a lot of words without unmuting. I'm still not used to it. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Just let me know when you're ready to share it, and I'll put it on. I'll take mine off.
Right, I can see some people coming through. Great, yeah, if you give me permission to share screen, I can start sharing the word cloud.
Lovely, go for it.
Thank you. And just let me know if you can see all those words coming up. Really interesting that gender and sexism has come up the most so far. We've also got imposter syndrome, anti-blackness, Islamophobia, structural racism. I can see a few more people left to share their words, so I'll just keep it up a little bit longer. Lots about gender, being taken seriously, Asian stereotyping, regional identity as well, yeah, mental health barriers. That's great. I think everyone has submitted now. So, a couple more coming through. You can see we clearly all face a lot of different types of barriers in society. That's definitely a major component of what intersectionality looks like. Really interesting. Thank you very much for... Sorry, thank you everyone for being so open and honest about that. That's probably quite a hard start at what intersectionality is about. So the next question that's going to come up for you, just going to stop sharing for a minute, is more about what do you actually feel comfortable in terms of your identity. So in a second, you should now see the second question come up, which is, what identities do you affiliate yourself with? I'll just give it a minute as they come in before I start sharing the word cloud again. Okay, great. I'll start showing the word cloud as they started to come in. Brilliant. So we've got things like woman, female, male, a Londoner as well, being vegan, being a sister, LGBT, some more specific ones being Pakistani, being Ghanaian, being a researcher. I'll just give it 30 more seconds for anyone else who wants to contribute their identities. We seem to be stuck on 12 people, so I might leave it there. Don't worry if you haven't contributed. But this is also to show you there's two sides to intersectionality. Yes, it is exploring the barriers that we face, but it's also about finding out about what identities that we relate to or that we resonate with us, and exploring that in a lot of detail. So thank you so much for participating in that. It's really interesting to see what a wide range of people have joined us today. So I'm going to hand it back over to Azaan.
Lovely, thanks, Raiesa. And yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that was very interesting to see kind of how naturally, when we think about our identities, how many different things come out. And I think that's very much kind of a key point for this session today. That brings us, I think, nicely into kind of the first little thing that we want to talk to you about, which concerns kind of the origins of intersectionality, where it kind of comes from. You know, we put in the Eventbrite description about how often these days it can be seen as a bit of a trendy buzzword and so on. You kind of hear it, and you kind of hear certain commentators on certain political spectrums kind of frothing at the mouth when they hear the phrase. But hopefully we want to kind of debunk some of those myths. So essentially intersectionality emerges in the sort of 1980s and 1990s as part of a movement referred to as critical race theory. And critical race theory itself was a response to this kind of emergent thinking around kind of colorblind racism and this or kind of color blindness. So there was this kind of movement where people were starting to say, well, look, we don't see color, we see everybody as equal. There's only one race, the human race, and that kind of ideology and thinking. But what's interesting about that is that placement happens shortly after the end of the civil rights movements, where so much was done to try and kind of win rights over, particularly for people of color. And as part of this, there was a particular writer known as Kimberle Crenshaw, who kind of coins this term intersectionality. There's a quote on the screen here: because the intersectional experience is greater than the sum of racism and sexism. Any analysis that does not take intersectionality into account cannot sufficiently address the particular manner in which Black women are subordinated. So Crenshaw's focus at this sort of time was particularly around kind of the intersections of being a woman and Black and the kind of unique experiences that come along with that. Now, in the activity that we saw just before, we thought about the kind of different barriers that people face, as well as the different identities they have. And what essentially Crenshaw is talking about here is about the fact that the different identities that you have can create and generate very unique forms of disadvantage or experiences that need to be taken into account. And since the publication of her work, scholars and activists have started to kind of broaden the horizon of intersectionality to a range of issues, social identities, power dynamics, and so on. And another kind of key important point to take into account here is that intersectionality is effectively an analytic tool. As it says here, rooted in Black feminism and critical race theory, intersectionality is a method and a disposition, a heuristic and an analytic tool. And what's really important to remember about this is that it's less of a case of it being, you see something and that's intersectionality, but more of it's an analytic tool that will progress as time goes along. Paying attention to the movement of intersectionality helps us to make clear that theory is never done and we never finish. There's always kind of movements that will continue to happen, and that progress is going to be very important. At best, intersectionality is a tool to help us understand those changes and those movements. And as it says, today, intersectionality is used as a framework for understanding a range of social issues from education, healthcare, security, poverty, and a wide range of things. And I think one particular quote that I wanted to finish on here is this idea that an alternative approach to knowing what intersectionality is to assess what intersectionality does as a starting point for thinking about how else we might use that framework. And there, kind of nice little diagram to show how different identities can emerge from one single person. Pass to Raiesa.
Thank you. So, as Azaan has said, intersectionality has obviously developed quite a lot in lots of different fields. These are some of the sociologists that we found helpful in research. And if you are familiar with intersectionality and you know of scholars, please do add it to the chat. It's always really great to hear about what you found useful out of intersectionality. The commonality with the first four in this list is that some of their work considers diaspora communities and South Asian experiences. So they've developed and expanded on Kimberle Crenshaw's kind of seminal work on intersectionality. It's opened up so many windows globally, and these sociologists have been really key for a lot of research, but in particular my research. So I really do recommend looking into some of their work. So you might be thinking at this stage, intersectionality sounds like a great tool to use, but you might also be thinking there must be more to this than just looking at someone's identity, and you'd be right. So I'm going to take you on a bit more of a deeper dive into intersectionality with a scholar called Leslie McCall. So Leslie McCall is a sociologist who really considers the types of complexities that are associated with intersectionality. I've created a very basic Venn diagram here. So this isn't like endorsed by McCall, it's my interpretation of her approaches and her ideas. As you can see, she's sort of kind of three different approaches, which I'll kind of go through briefly, but I'm really interested in whether one of these approaches resonates with you more than the others. So as I'm explaining, please do put in the chat what kind of approach you prefer or what kind of resonates with you the most. So first of all, we've got anti-categorical. So that's the view, which kind of says it in the name, is the idea that society is just too irreducibly complex, there's too much fluidity, there's too much change in structures to determine kind of fixed social categories. Whatever you do, you'll always be simplifying the context where inequalities are born. So arguably, that approach has the best handle on intersectional complexity, because already there is a lot of skepticism in using social categories that could oversimplify societal issues. So that's the first approach. It's just a wider view on what society is really about. Then on the opposite side of the scale, we've got intercategorical complexity. And this one actually requires scholars to provisionally adopt existing social categories so that they can investigate relationships of inequality between different social groups. So just as an example, you might pick a social group such as Black Muslim women to understand how inequality manifests for them across those three different axes and those contexts that they live in altogether. So that can be helpful because we know that society is boxed into categories already. So the argument is that we should work within those existing categories and contexts to help support us in unpicking the inequalities that they face. And arguably, a lot of the research out there is already intercategorical, so that's quite helpful as well. In the middle, so a mesh of the two, we have the intra-categorical approach. So like the anti-categorical approach, it does question boundaries, it questions who's defining these social categories. But like the intercategorical approach, it does acknowledge that social categories at a given point in time can be really useful to investigate, but it also has this kind of critical stance towards those categories. So scholars who work in the middle there, in the kind of intra approach, they might focus on social groups that are at neglected points of intersection. So that's kind of helping them understand the complexities of lived experiences of groups that are kind of at the margins. So I'm going to leave you to consider who those groups might be, but I would definitely say that it goes beyond the kind of typical three-dimensional paradigm, which is race, gender, and class. So it's important to think about, well, what's beyond those categories? And at the same time, we do have to remember that we're all individuals in our social groups. So that's quite important. And to paraphrase one of the scholars I mentioned earlier, Akbar, she says that no two experiences are ever the same because people will understand and interact with events in different ways. So intersectionality does consider that. It's not just about social groups and social identity, but it's also about the individual as well. So like I said, I am really interested in hearing about what makes sense to you. Is it that kind of broader anti-categorical theme, or is it the more kind of minutiae of the intercategorical approach? So do let us know in the chat. But now I'm going to hand it over to Azaan.
Lovely, thanks, Raiesa. So I think one of the things that you might be starting to feel, or particularly getting from our kind of session, is that this kind of analytic framework that we have, as it continues to develop, can seem quite complex, and in the sense that it can almost seem quite kind of difficult or abstract to wonder, how do we apply such an analytic tool to kind of very real social problems? And hopefully, as we take you through the research that I'm doing and through Raisa's doing, you'll start to see how intersectionality has been started to apply or can be used in a kind of analytic framework that allows us to kind of address social concerns and social issues. So take you through my research. So my particular research area is looking at kind of intersectional aspirations and how British school children's aspirations are affected by their intersectional backgrounds. So just to speak a little bit about kind of where my interest in this area comes from. So I'm of dual heritage. I'm of Bangladeshi and Pakistani background, but born in Britain. I grew up in Barking-Dagenham, an area with one of the highest child poverty rates in London. And growing up at school, I was one of very, very few ethnic minorities, very few Asians, majority working class community. And I would say that I had a kind of slightly more middle class upbringing compared to a lot of my peers, but I saw kind of a lot of deprivation around me. And I felt that, you know, given the things that I'd seen, given the things that I experienced, I wanted to come back to the community that gave me so much. And that kind of encouraged me later on to become a teacher. So I ended up qualifying as a teacher and went back to teach at the same school that I went to, and then later moved on to teach at a girls' school in East Ham. And so I think the combination of kind of, you know, growing up in a particular kind of area with all different kinds of people, and then later teaching those kind of backgrounds, led me to become quite interested in these sorts of areas as well. I also then did, before I became a teacher, I did an undergraduate degree in philosophy at UCL. And during that time, a lot of my interests were around philosophy and race. I think that a sort of natural progression has been towards this kind of area of looking how intersectionality theory, critical race theory can be applied to kind of educational concerns. So looking at my particular research, the kind of background context for this is that kind of children from a range of different backgrounds are at the top and bottom of performance in terms of GCSE. So, for example, kind of the the fringes at the bottom, we noticed that white working class boys, for example, Gypsy and Roma travellers, and Black Caribbean children are among the kind of lower performers at GCSE level. But at the top end, you've got students from Chinese background, Indian background, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, and Black African. So what's interesting is that there's a kind of range there. There's no kind of set kind of particular thing. For example, in this graph that you can see on the screen here, the differences in gender. Now, overall, it seems that girls tend to do better at GCSE in terms of their results. And there are differences across different ethnic groups there as well. But at the same time, when you start to think about how some of these results and these attainment levels translate into later earnings, and for things like A levels and career, we still know that, for example, there's a significant and an important gender pay gap. We still notice that Bangladeshi and Pakistani people are among the highest groups of unemployment. So how is it the case that something like good attainment at GCSE doesn't necessarily translate to later life kind of achievements in the ways that we measure good life outcomes? It doesn't necessarily seem to translate. So one of the key areas in kind of trying to address that particular kind of gap has been around this question of aspiration. In particular, kind of studies undertaken in the United States in the 60s concluded that educational aspirations were an important part of the reason why young people from better off families had higher levels of educational achievement. And then recent data in England has also reached a similar conclusion. A number of recent studies kind of showed that those from better off families have been found to have higher intentions of going to university and higher levels of progress and achievement over the period than those from less well-off families. So some of the literature started to think about aspirations as a particular area or a reason as to why there's not this translation from GCSE up to A-level, university and careers. And then my particular interest here is to see where intersectionality fits in within that kind of locus of aspiration. So kind of my particular interest is looked at, in response to kind of a lot of the literature which looks at primarily focuses on white working class students. So you notice, for example, in the news, there are lots of stories about how the white working class are often the most left behind. White working class boys are performing the worst. So whilst in terms of the data, some of that is true. As I've kind of mentioned at the top, there's quite a lot of variance. And I think that variance leads itself naturally into thinking about how intersectionality applies to this research on aspirations. So what I particularly intended to do was to start by, most of my dissertation is largely literature review, looking at some of the theoretical elements. But what I did is I ended up then conducting a series of interviews, one focus group with 8 students from a range of different backgrounds, and then with one head teacher as well. And I wanted to kind of show you some of the things that came out of that. I conducted basically a focus group with 8 students from a range of backgrounds, including those who identified as male, female, non-binary, as well as a range of kind of class, ethnicity, and other social backgrounds. And then I also interviewed the head teacher of that school. So there are a range of different questions that we asked. So I asked questions like, what kind of things make it easier or harder for you to reach your goals? I asked them about what kind of things they want to do in the future. I asked them about whether or not they feel like their social background or their identities have any influence on their plans for the future. And then things like, who influenced your decisions about what GCSEs you want to pick, those kinds of things. And for the head teacher, I asked questions like, are there particular groups that find it easier or harder to talk about their aspirations? Do students' ethnicities or social backgrounds affect the way that they aspire? And there are also some questions about whether or not they feel that their school is in a good area. And there's some interesting things that came out. And again, what's interesting to note is that very much in the way that we did right at the start, that kind of intersectional understanding is quite inherent. A lot of people recognize that they're not just one thing. They're not just a man. They're not just, black, for example. They're not just Asian. They experience a range of different identities, and that came out in that interview. So here, one guy is saying, so obviously I'm black, and then I'm a woman. So those kind of factors they're a bit much. And even when you're trying to pick things or do even little things. Another student said, so I've grown up in East London, of course. I'm black, meaning that I've seen many people around me getting into kind of bad paths, even people that I haven't known, and seeing them on the news, knowing that something bad might have happened to them. And I really, really wish it could be different when I think about the future potential that they had. And it makes me want to do something different myself. And then another student says that I don't know, it's because of my race, but my gender and my race affect, and the culture that I'm in affect the things that I get to do. So it's interesting how students really reflected on their own intersectional backgrounds, and just with very vague question prompts, they were able to bring out these sort of intersectional identities. What was interesting is that the students kind of described their experiences in this way in a very intersectional approach, but then at the same time, the head teacher, who obviously has a very different kind of position, then took a slightly different kind of idea towards it. So they say here, sometimes that comes with more attitude. We've got some parents who are considered to be very disadvantaged, but they're the most supportive, aspirational behind their children parents. We've got other parents who are way more advantaged, but they're a lot more disinterested. So it's not, I don't think you can neatly divide into advantage or disadvantage, or even divide it into ethnicity. It doesn't necessarily work that well. So I think what's interesting is that there are different aspects to the debate. Some think that you kind of, we touched on McCall's kind of intercategorical versus anti-categorical. Some people will take the approach that, it's very difficult to categorize these things, and that categorization isn't necessarily going to be helpful in helping us to understand how we address any of these issues. But at the same time, we can't ignore the experiences of students who recognize these categories as a reality of their lives. So when we start to think about what policymakers can do for these sorts of issues, we probably have to address both of those concerns. The one concern being that there are these categories, these concrete categories that affect me in some real way. It affects me in the way that I choose to do certain things, in the things that I'm able to do. But at the same time, from a kind of wider analytic perspective, there are those who say, well, it's very difficult for us to say this group gets this particular kind of help, or this group that gets this particular kind of help, because of the variance within that. And I think for policymakers going forward, they have to address both sides of that debate in order to be able to effectively address the kind of concerns that we've talked about, how we address that movement for particular groups into ensuring that they are able to achieve the most of what they intend to do. So yeah, that's a little bit about my research, and I'll pass on to Raiesa to talk about her research.
Thanks, Azaan. That was so interesting. I didn't know the kind of details of Azaan's research, and a lot of it really resonated with my work as well, which is quite nice to see, actually. So my research, a little bit similar, a little bit different. It's about intersectional identity and career aspirations. In particular, I looked at the female British Bangladeshi experience. So just to give you a bit of background on why I'm interested in this topic, like I mentioned, I work for an educational organisation that supports schools with their career provisions. And I've worked in the educational third sector for about 7 years. And what I've been really made aware of is how different, how disparate the career provisions are from school to school. It can turn into a bit of a tick box exercise. Not all schools have a fully dedicated careers lead. They don't have proper funding. And even if they do, they have really tight timetables for their students. That is all in spite of the fact that it is now statutorily required to give out careers guidance. So it's really challenging for schools. And the reason why I think careers provisions, careers guidance is really important is because there has been research that careers guidance can boost social and cultural capital, and it can even boost earnings in the future. So it's really important to investigate how career education is being delivered in schools. So that's where I want to look at how career awareness and aspirations come into this group. So although there has been research on careers education, in my experience, I found barely any research on how careers education affects intersectional groups, especially those who are most disadvantaged. So that was really important for me to investigate. I know there's some students on this, well, most of us are students on this session, and I think everyone tends to find a theory that resonates with them. And for me, it was critical race theory and intersectionality. But in particular, I took the sociology of race and education module last year at UCL. And it was actually the first time that it had ever been taught by a Black woman at UCL called Victoria Choudhury. And she actually gave us the option of, instead of writing your kind of average academic essay, we could write a self-reflective piece about our experiences of race. So when I was thinking about my dissertation research topic, that self-reflective piece was very much in my mind, and thinking about what's important to research that would keep me motivated. I also read an article by Aminul Huq, who is a second-generation sociologist like me, and he wrote about the third generation of British Bangladeshis. So it's a community that I am a part of. I think sometimes that can be important as a researcher. It's a really fascinating community. It's full of contrast and richness of history. But there are still a lot of British Bangladeshis who are living in poverty. And there's also a very strong wage gap between them and their white British peers. So those were my kind of influences for my research. And I ran focus groups and interviews with 5 girls who identified as third generation British Bangladeshis. The gaps in the research that I identified was to investigate this group's identity experiences in social and educational spaces, with a particular focus on their career aspirations. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. Sorry, I hope that's not too small, the writing there for anyone. I'm not going to go into a massive amount of detail about my findings, but I thought it might be interesting for you to read these quotes that I collected from my data. I guess the number one thing that you learn is just how multifaceted these girls' experiences are, and very unique to each of them. They've all faced barriers in areas of their life, from their family, their school, their friends, from society. But on a positive note, a commonality that I found was the support that they had from their parents in following the career path of their choice. And sometimes that support was on a different level, but they all felt like they had the backing of their parents. The 5 girls were all interested in different career pathways. So we had a girl who was interested in politics, another in sociology, there was therapy, journalism, art, so a really wide array. But these are the paths that they particularly viewed as not being a traditional Bangladeshi pathway of becoming, like, say, a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer. So I think for me, one of the main findings was this generational difference, to possibly veer from the so-called stereotypes that they felt were there of being female, being Bangladeshi, being Muslim, and going for their own career path. They also showed a lot of resistance to anyone that was ignorant about their personal identity. But obviously alongside that, there does come this type of fear that they are following these pathways where they're basically being trailblazers, and they don't have a lot of people ahead of them in their networks to follow. So they're forging their own paths, which is a really brave thing to do. For me personally, I'm really excited about this third generation to break through barriers that previous generations might have struggled with more. It's really interesting to see this space, not just for British Bangladeshis, but for all diaspora groups, and how these generations are going to develop. And I can just see that Azaan is getting a video ready for us to watch. Thanks, Azaan.
I hadn't realised that it had switched the screen, so I'll put it back.
No, it's fine.
I'll put it back up on here. I'll let you finish, and then we'll move on to that.
No, we're good. That was my last point. But maybe just to point out, the last quote that I really wanted people to see was on agency and resistance. Is, you know, despite all these kind of barriers that they're facing, the girls do feel like they have a responsibility to change the stereotypes that have been enforced on them, and that they're working really hard in their future pathways. Thanks, Azaan.
Lovely, thank you so much, Raiesa. And again, you know, it's really great to see the kind of similarities that we've got, but also at the same time the differences. You know, so I think what it really reflects is that across the kind of research areas that we're in, there are lots of things that, you know, scholars will agree on, lots of things the scholars will disagree on, and we kind of have similar areas that we're interested in. But because of just how much work there is to do in this area, everybody's got some really unique contributions to make, and it's really exciting to see that. I think that more or less brings us towards near the end. Now, before we kind of go on to the sort of discussion Q&A session, I just wanted to show you a brief bit of Kimberle Crenshaw, and just because I think it's just really great to hear it from the person who originated the idea herself. Can we hear that? Bear with me 1 second. Classic Zoom things. Share sound. Right, that. Can we hear this now?
I'd like to try something new. Those of you who are able, please stand up. Okay, so I'm going to name some names. When you hear a name that you don't recognize, you can't tell me anything about them, I'd like you to take a seat and stay seated. The last person standing, we're going to see what they know, okay? All right. Eric Garner, Mike Brown, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray. So those of you who are still standing, I'd like you to turn around and take a look. I'd say half to most of the people are still standing. So let's continue. Michelle Cusseau. Tanisha Anderson. Ara Russer. Megan Hockaday. So if we look around again, there are about 4 people still standing. And actually, I'm not going to put you on the spot. I just say that to encourage transparency, so you can be seated. So those of you who recognize the first group of names know that these were African Americans who've been killed by the police over the last 2.5 years. What you may not know is that the other list is also African Americans who have been killed within the last 2 years. Only one thing distinguishes the names that you know from the names that you don't know: gender. So let me first let you know that there's nothing at all distinct about this audience that explains the pattern of recognition that we've just seen. I've done this exercise dozens of times around the country. I've done it to women's rights organizations. I've done it with civil rights groups. I've done it with professors. I've done it with students. I've done it with psychologists. I've done it with sociologists. I've done it even with progressive members of Congress. And everywhere, the awareness of the level of police violence that Black women experience is exceedingly low. Now, it is surprising, isn't it, that this would be the case? I mean, there are 2 issues involved here. There's police violence against African Americans, and there's violence against women, 2 issues that have been talked about a lot lately. But when we think about who is implicated by these problems, when we think about who's victimized by these problems, the names of these Black women never come to mind. Now, communications experts tell us that when facts do not fit with the available frames, people have a difficult time incorporating new facts into their way of thinking about a problem. These women's names have slipped through our consciousness because there are no frames for us to see them, no frames for us to remember them, no frames for us to hold them. As a consequence, reporters don't lead with them, policymakers don't think about them, and politicians aren't encouraged or demanded that they speak to them. Now, you might ask, well, why does a frame matter? I mean, after all, an issue that affects Black people and an issue that affects women, wouldn't that necessarily include Black people who are women and women who are Black people? Well, the simple answer is that this is a trickle-down approach to social justice, and many times it just doesn't work. Without frames that allow us to see how social problems impact all the members of a targeted group, many will fall through the cracks of our movements, left to suffer in virtual isolation. But it doesn't have to be this way. Many years ago, I began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems, like racism and sexism, are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. Now,
okay, so I just wanted to take us up to at least that section where she begins to talk about kind of intersectionality and kind of how it comes about. But I saw in the chats there were lots of people kind of finding the video very interesting, very useful. And I think it kind of very importantly reminds us just quite how important this work and this research is, and that there's an urgency in kind of developing this area of research for us to all understand kind of a lot of these problems and to help us to get a better sense of how we can solve a lot of these issues. So I wanted to end here with some questions for discussions that we thought we could come up with. We'll start off with some kind of general Q&A. So after I've read these questions out, feel free to ask any general clarificatory questions or further questions that you had. And then after that, we'd love to hear from you guys about your thoughts on these things. So some questions for discussion here. Do you think intersectionality is a useful analytic tool for social issues? And why, if you do, and why not, perhaps if you don't? How do you think it could be used more effectively in education? So if you have any kind of education experience or anything like that, how do you think education policymakers can use it? And more specifically, how do you think policymakers should pay attention to intersectionality theory? Is it just a case of, there's just abstract theory that we can just leave by the wayside? Or is there a kind of more proactive way that we can use intersectionality theory to make real change? So other than that, that leaves us to the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to your questions and discussion.
Thank you guys so much for that. That was so interesting. Even for someone like myself who's never looked into kind of education or issues in education, but definitely have thought about intersectionality before. I think a lot of people here do have a background, or at least a couple that I kind of recognize do have a background in education, or at least in thinking about these issues. So we've got 10 minutes left. We can discuss these questions together if anyone does have a particular contribution they'd like to make to any of the three questions. If you have something, maybe even you have a question to ask back. I know that in the chat earlier, OJ said, yeah, would you like to take that on, read it, and then discuss?
OJ, do you want to read your question out again, just so we just have a clear sense, and then either me or Raiesa can take a stab at it? I think probably Raiesa, just because I'm less smart than Raiesa. So.
Can I ask a different question? I didn't like that question anymore.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
So the first question asked, do you think intersectionality is a useful analytic tool for social issues? My question to both yourself, Azaan, and Raiesa is, do you think at some point we may need to find a framework to prevent intersectionality from falling into the trap of the narcissism of minor differences, where the categories become so small, it becomes difficult to use them properly in analysis? And do you think such a tool has been developed to prevent those categories from becoming too small, or do you think that's just a likely thing to happen when you delve deep enough into intersectionality?
So my kind of initial response to this is that part of the thing about intersectionality that we've talked about is this idea that it's quite fluid, right? So it adapts, it changes, it goes along. With regards to this question about categorization in particular, is that intersectionality doesn't necessarily generate the categories by which we analyze particular things, right? So it's not like, it's not like intersectional writers are coming up with what gender, race, disability, class looks like. These are kind of social categories that are devised and used in a number of different areas, right? So economists will use certain categories to analyze certain issues by those particular things. Political scientists will do the same thing. So in many ways, these kind of categorizations, that will happen naturally. Now, intersectionality and its place within those kind of the changes and adaptations of those categorizations, it has a place insofar as it recognizes that these categories exist in some sort of reality and it affects people in some sort of reality. Whether or not analyzing something by an intersectional frame itself will change those categories is hard to say. I think there's a lot of things that affect why a categorization comes up. So one really good example is that, particularly at the time that intersectionality was coined as a phrase, there wasn't a lot of discussion about trans rights, right? So now we start to see that we have better language to describe those from non-binary identities and those from identities that are beyond the binary, essentially. So now that language has changed, and that has happened as a very particular social movement, intersectionality will adapt to understanding what is it about being from those particular identities and how it affects other things as well. So I guess the kind of summary to answer to your question is that the categorizations will change and adapt as time goes along, and intersectionality will just try its best to kind of stay above it and work alongside those categorizations and those social movements.
Yeah, I think that's
Thank you.
that's a really good point that Azaan made, and I definitely agree with it on some level. It's really interesting because intersectionality did start off with being about Black women, and the kind of magic of it is that it's been able to adapt to different contexts. I've been able to use it to talk about the British Bangladeshi diaspora. Can those categories get too nitty gritty? I feel like my category is already quite niche in a way, but I think it's also at the crux of it, it's about inequalities, and at the end of the day, it's about social justice. So yeah, if we do have to get down to those small categories that make someone face inequalities that they shouldn't be, then I don't see a problem with those categories becoming more important in a way.
Thank you.
I think potentially we had another question here from Sharon. Sharon, would you like me to read out the question, or would you like to read out yourself? If you want me to read it out, just type in the chat. You're in the library. Okay, cool. I'll read out for you then. So quick question for Raiesa regarding her research. You mentioned being a second-gen British Bangladeshi. I wondered what she found interviewing third-gen British Bangladeshi girls and what she found were the similarities and differences between the generations, between second and third generation. What resonated with her from her own experiences growing up and what was brand new?
Thanks, Sharon, and thanks for joining from a library. Yeah, lots of similarities and lots of differences. It was really interesting. They resonated with me a lot, but I also recognise that the girls that I interviewed, they grew up in London and they grew up in very diverse communities. They all felt such a strong sense of pride in their identity. But for me, almost kind of unusually for a second-gen British Bangladeshi, given that there are these hubs of Bangladeshi communities. I grew up in a very middle-class white British town, so I was veered on the side of not feeling very comfortable in my identity and not feeling pride in it, and wanted to hide aspects of my identity. So it was really nice seeing that these girls who, it might be because they grew up in these diverse communities, but also they felt empowered enough to say, I'm really proud to be a British Bangladeshi. Really interestingly as well, which is something I wanted to bring up in my research but didn't have the space for, was their use of social media and their belief in social media as a source of change, as a source of somewhere where they can implement social justice and social change. I think that's a massive difference between my generation and their generation. Thanks for that question.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Sharon, for that question as well. I think it was really interesting to hear some of the thoughts there. Does anybody else have any other further questions, clarifications that they'd like to ask before we ask some questions to you guys about your thoughts on these matters? 5, 4, 3. Usually a countdown encourages questions, so 3, 2, 1. Okay, great. So we'll move on to.
You can really tell Azaan that you're a teacher.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yes, I will definitely drop the link for the Kimberle video. Yeah. The thing is, counting down encourages pressure for everyone. So it's something that I've picked up and I've decided to use in lots of places. But no, okay, cool. Yeah, we'll definitely drop the link for that video. Thanks, OJ. So some questions for discussion that I wanted to ask to you guys. One thing that in particular that I'm quite interested in hearing from you guys about is what your thoughts are about policymakers how policymakers could use intersectionality theory. So do you think it's one of these things where it's like, intersectionality at best is discussed in the academy, in universities, people publish some papers on it, but when you come down to politics and the nitty gritty and the actual doing of things, that it's just going to get ignored? Or is there something that we can do to encourage this kind of thinking? Any thoughts? Feel free to just unmute and come in. Come on, someone's got to go first.
May I start?
Yeah, please feel free, Maria. And then I think Dave unmuted afterwards, so we'll go to Maria, then to Dave.
Yeah, I think this approach definitely can be used and should be used by policymakers by several reasons. First of all, this approach allows to avoid generalization and focus on specific targeted groups, and it will make policies more efficient if we focus on problems and needs on specific, more narrowed social groups. So on different stages, we can talk about researching problems, on formulating policies, implementing, and so on, how it will help. But I would be a little bit skeptical about this, and I would like to maybe mention and maybe raise this discussion about where this approach, like implementation of intersectionality, can work and cannot work, and probably it's more likely to work in open societies and democratic societies, not patriarchal societies in which policymakers engage with hegemonic identities and protect these identities. So I would ask, like, what do you think about this? Like, how policymakers can challenge status quo by intersectionality approach if they are involved in this status quo and they don't want to change public policy. So Lord used this phrase that master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. So how we can avoid it? Is it like big challenge for intersectionality and its implementation, or not?
Yeah, I think, again, if I kind of speak kind of very kind of reactively to it, kind of just what my initial thoughts are, I suppose, is that I think it's one of those things where, so I'll give you an example, right? The government at the moment, they are now starting to publish data on attainment, on educational attainment, by ethnicity, by gender, by social class, right? So there's starting to be a recognition that these sorts of identities do matter in some way. And I think on this particular point of, master's tools will never kind of destroy master's house. I suppose, I think that that's, quite true in many ways. As a formerly ardent Marxist, I would like to think that that the capitalists craft the tool of their own destruction in some sense. And I suppose it's up to individuals. And I think, what Raiesa mentioned about kind of social media going forward as a really powerful tool. I imagine that as we go forward, having young people have a sense of their own identities and how much of a cross-section they experience is likely to help us see some sort of change, whether that be through campaigning, whether that be through those same young people then ending up in positions of power, all of those sorts of things. So I suppose the progress is likely to be quite slow, but it will happen in some way, shape or form. Raiesa, did you want to add anything to that?
I completely agree with what you were saying. and I had a point in my head, but I was typing, so I've forgotten it. I'll try to come back to it.
No worries.